Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
I must preface this with a few things. This encounter is second-hand but was told to me on multiple occasions by the person that experienced this. I am a natural skeptic and cynic, so I can't say I 100% believe it, but his telling of it was pretty simple yet concise and did not vary between retellings. I've known this guy for many years, and his advice and input on just about everything is well-reasoned and always helpful, so I'll just take his word on it, even if with a grain of salt. Also keep in mind I am not a seasoned writer, and past and present tense may get a little jumbled, but I'll keep it clear and accurate as best I can. So let's get down to business. My friend, we'll call him Marv, likes to go solitary camping on occasion to be one with nature, and the things that go along with that. He is also an avid gun collector and enthusiast. I don't remember exactly when he said this took place, but it was a few years back, and he decided to go camping on a whim. He packed his gear, a few guns, hunting rifle and .45 sidearm specifically, and headed out into the country onto a vast swatch of property owned by a friend of his. He had full permission and the works. This happened close to the Kisatchie National Forest in central Louisiana. I won't be any more specific other than that. Safe to say it's miles and miles of forest and wilderness. He liked to hike in pretty deep and camp at a specific spot he found a few trips prior. These details are kind of sparse, as it's not really the meat and potatoes to this encounter. So he made his way in and set up camp in his usual small clearing for the night. Skipping ahead a few hours, it was now late afternoon when he heard leaves crunching and twigs being stepped on. He assumed it was an animal at first and got up from cooking something on the fire to try to get a look. He gazed in the direction of the noise and saw a man approaching through the trees a good many yards away. He has described his etiquette for dealing with other people in very remote places as always being cautious, as more often than not people he comes across are armed like him. He tries to stay as friendly as possible, but still keeps his guard up, looking for any ulterior motive, as you never can tell what some folks are up to out in the middle of nowhere. He'll make chit-chat with them, find out generally what they're up to if he can, and occasionally share a meal. He's never really met anyone nefarious as of yet other than this situation and maybe one other, but that's a whole other ordeal. So one thing that sets off small alarm bells for him is he knows he's the only one with permission to be on this property, and secondly, this guy is not dressed for the location at all. He said the guy was wearing a white t-shirt, short blue jogging shorts, and white socks and sneakers. Mind you, Marv is miles out in the middle of the woods away from any paths, roadways, houses, or anything really. Nobody is going to casually stroll into his current location dressed like that unless they are lost and confused. It was early fall but not quite cool, very normal for Louisiana. So there's a ton of mosquitoes, ticks, and other insects aplenty. You're not going to have most of your skin exposed if you can help it deep in the woods. I know that all too well from personal experience myself. So Marv assumes something might be up and calls out,
"Hey there, do you need help or something?"
Pretty loud. Definitely loud enough to be heard. The guy keeps walking forward, staring directly at him. Marv is starting to get unnerved, and as I said, I know this guy well, and he's cool as a cucumber in a tense situation. Getting more uneasy as the guy is closing the distance, he gets to his feet and loudly declares,
"Hey man, can I help you with something or what?"
The guys are 15 to 20 feet away from Marv now, standing at the edge of the clearing and the forest. The guy, looking Marv dead in the eye, speaks and clearly says, "Help me." Marv said he was already starting to actually get worried at this point, because he said the way the guy said this was as if something that didn't know exactly how to talk was saying help me, or at least that's what he first thought. It did not sound right. The guy, still unmoving, says help me. Again, slightly more emphatic, but really just slightly louder. Marv said this is when he picked up on what was truly wrong about this. He said the timbre of the voice was more female and actually sounded like a recording being played back, and that the guy's lip and mouth movements weren't matching up with the phrase. It's like he was just opening his mouth, emitting the phrase, and closing it again. Marv asked,
"What do you need help with?"
not daring to back up or move whatsoever. The guy, still standing motionless as well, still looking directly at him, said help me again and repeated the phrase another 3 times, slowly but not louder in volume. Marv, now totally unsure of what the hell is going on, interrupts the guy by barking,
"Alright, you need to fucking go now unless you actually need my help. Do you need my help or not?"
He continued, loud and firm in tone. The guy didn't miss a beat and started up with the help me's again and made it as if to take another step in Marv's direction. Marv told me that he then did the only thing that made sense in the moment and drew his .45 semi-auto pistol and pointed it at the guy, telling him again,
"You need to fucking go. I don't care what you want."
The guy starts to get more animated and agitated, actually starting to say the phrase louder now over and over but not stepping closer or backing away. Marv did what he thought was right given his current predicament, assuming he was dealing with an unstable or potentially dangerous individual, and discharged a round into the ground in front of the guy. Now this is where it gets fully batshit crazy as the guy stops uttering the phrase, goes silent, and still staring at Marv full on backflips and somersaults backwards into the woods and immediately out of sight. Now I know what you're thinking because I had and still have the same reaction. That sounds like bullshit for sure, but Marv gave no indication of falsehood and told me this multiple times, each time in dead serious demeanor. Yet Marv said the guy backflipped away effortlessly as if pulled back by an unseen tension coil. He described it as completely humanly unnatural and totally out of place. The guy had just appeared and repeated the same phrase over and over, eventually becoming almost frantic before Marv shot at the ground before him, causing it to flee. Marv said he stood there focused on the forest where the guy just flipped into and saw and heard no further movement. It was like the guy had never even been there. He stayed like this as the sun began to set and the normal night noises crept in. As I mentioned before, Marv is a pretty unshakable fellow and actually stayed in the area for the night and next night before returning with no further incident. When he had told me and some other friends about this, of course we asked many questions. We asked him to elaborate on the guy's speech sounds. He said the more he thought about it after the incident, the more sure he was that it was definitely a female's voice coming from the guy. It was like it had heard someone say this and mimicked it like a parrot or other talking bird would. Almost like a lure. He doesn't know what it wanted. It didn't give any indication to follow or utter anything else. It reacted immediately to the gunshot, and you know what followed there. He has been back to the property since with no other strange occurrences. The only other minute detail that I can think of is he did remember hearing during the early morning of the first night what sounded like a gunshot off in the distance, and it did sound eerily similar to his .45. He thought he may have heard it again on the hike back out. There are people that hunt in the area, of course, and it could have just been that. He couldn't be sure. Since this incident and one other he had in a completely different location. He did some online research of the whole Kissimmee area and found many legends, stories, and supposed encounters dealing with skinwalkers and other unnerving bits of Native American folklore in the area. Not to mention mimics and other similar supposed creatures. A lot of his encounters line up with these tales, but there's nothing tangible to prove it, of course. But even as a skeptic, it does make me wonder about strange things in the remote and untouched areas of our world that can't be explained. So I can attempt to answer questions about this, but I'm only going off what I was told, so keep that in mind. I can potentially ask Marv about the ones I can't answer myself, as I should be hanging out with him in a few days.
This story takes place around 2 or 3 years ago near the border of Louisiana in Texas. My uncle owns property around that area and uses it as a hunting ground. I have been multiple times in the past because he needed help clearing out most of the trees. I have even hunted there once and was able to nab a nice doe. On the morning of the encounter, we arrived at the place around 4 a.m. If you take a look at the pictures I have linked, you will be able to see the entrance, the campsite, and the opening up ahead. This is where my uncle and I set up our tent. The opening leads to 3 main clearings, all leading to feeders. As you may all be aware of, hunting asks for a lot of patience and avid listening, and we did just that. Nothing out of the ordinary happens until around 3 hours after we had arrived. The 20-degree weather was beginning to warm up, but not enough to keep my hands and feet from shivering. The woods are a beautiful sight to behold. Nature is the main reason why I loved going hunting in the first place after all. I stared down the scope of my rifle and scanned the area, searching for any woodland creatures and examining the beauty around me. As I look around, something catches my eye. Mind you, if I hadn't been looking around so much through the scope, I wouldn't have seen this thing. It is hard to explain, but it looked like a piece of wood with the proportions of the upper part of a torso and a head. At the time, it didn't strike me as something out of the ordinary. It simply looked like a part of the wood's foliage, yet I was drawn to it. I even had a funny thought that if I had looked away and looked back it would have changed positions. Due to this random thought, I checked up on the thing every 10 to 15 minutes. Every time I would move my crosshair over it, the scenery remained the same. Around an hour later, I continued my newfound routine. Once I looked over to where the thing was supposed to be at, I noticed it was gone. After looking over to the same spot of the woods for around an hour, I knew that particular spot very well and knew for sure that the thing had just disappeared. I'm sure some readers will wonder why this is a worthy story to even tell. What I would like you all to take note of is that the thing did not move an inch. It remained completely still for over an hour and I hadn't seen the slightest bit of change. If it were alive, why would it have just stayed like that? The appearance was very off-putting as well now that I think about it. The more I try to picture it, the less it makes sense. It was sort of out of focus? Maybe this is why I was drawn to it, the slight difference between the rest of the scenery. Again, would like to preface how hard it was to even see this thing. I was really looking around the place and just so happened to look directly at this.
A few years back I was visiting Louisiana. New Orleans, Louisiana specifically, on some business and decided to do a bit of sightseeing. I visited some cemetery that a brochure on and Rice directed me to, Bourbon Street, some historic hotel. The Monteleone, nice place, and got some beignet. Standard touristy things. About my third night there I got myself roasted on cheap tequila and decided to wander the French Quarter, bad idea. I ended up in some spiritualist/voodoo shop that had a wide assortment of things a drunk tourist could gawk at. Out of all the things I saw, the one that caught my eye was this big lump of quartz, about the size of my index finger but a little fatter. I should say that I haven't stolen anything before and I, being drunk as a skunk, don't recall stealing it. I also want to mention that I'm terribly embarrassed that it happened. I do know, however, that I woke up the next morning with a hangover and the quartz in my shirt pocket. No recollection of paying for it and the same amount of cash I'd had when I left the bar, which I did count because I was in a strange city and drinking. I felt bad but figured it was too late to worry about it now and went on about the last couple days of my trip before returning home. After leaving the state things started getting a bit strange for me though. When I hit the border to Mississippi the brakes in my car gave out completely for a solid 10 miles, and then suddenly started working again. I chalked it up to car issues like anyone would and powered back to my parents' house, praying that it wouldn't happen again. It didn't. I stayed the night with my family and I took my car to the shop the next day. There were no issues that the mechanic could find so I got an oil change and went back to my own house. When I got there the first thing I noticed was the smell. I thought something had died in the walls or under the crawl space. I flipped the light switch, nothing. It turns out my power had cut out. I kicked the breaker and it cut back on but flickers for a while. The smell, it turns out, was coming from my fridge. While the power was out, a freezer full of meat had thawed and begun to rot. When I opened it the smell hit me like a punch in the nose and gnats buzzed out from the freezer. I lost about $100 worth of beef and I was pretty pissed. I unloaded my luggage and sitting right on top of my clothes was the quartz. I laughed and texted a buddy that I was having shitty luck and we had a chuckle over the idea that I had a cursed rock in my house. I went to bed a few hours later after I cleaned the freezer out and did my best to get rid of the smell, and that night I had some pretty terrible dreams. I was trapped in my house. I wasn't locked in per se, but every exit I approached was blocked by a shadowy wispy figure of a woman. She lit my house on fire while I was inside and when I tried to leave she would stop me at every door and window. I woke up around 3 a.m. and decided to say fuck it and stay awake. I didn't think sleep was worth it if I wasn't going to be rested so I started watching TV. I lay there a short while before I noticed it. On the ceiling above my head were two very large wavy black lines. I had no idea what they were so I flicked on the light to see better and they scrambled away. I'm frightened of insects so I jumped out of bed and went to get a fly swatter from the kitchen. When I got to the hallway I almost puked. There on the floor were easily 2-3 dozen more of the squiggly black bugs. They were centipedes or millipedes, I don't really know the difference, but they were about 6 inches long each and a rich black. I slept in my car the rest of the night, terrified of insects, and called an exterminator the next morning. I started to take the idea of the quartz being cursed a little more seriously, and decided that it wouldn't hurt to call another friend of mine. He's a Native American and practices some kind of spiritualism, so I figured I'd go to him with my story. I texted him and he asked me to bring the quartz over to his place. When I get there I step out of my car and feel something wet. The bottom of my shoe had come off and was flopping there, my sock foot was directly in a mud puddle. Luckily I still had a pair of dress shoes in the car from my trip so I put those on even though it looked silly. When I handed him the quartz, I retold him the story of what had been going on and how I'd woken up with the crystal, and no recollection of paying for it. He called me a drunk asshole, which I couldn't argue, and inspected it. He held it up to the light, turned it over in his hand a few times, licked it, and then sniffed it. When he sniffed it, he turned his nose up like it smelled sour and asked, "Have you smelled this thing?" I told him that no, I hadn't, and shoved it under my nose. It reeked. It was that same smell of rotting meat that had greeted me when I came through the door at my house. He took the quartz and started a small fire in a pot with some dried sticks in it. He puts the crystal into the fire and starts to mumble something I don't understand under his breath. What struck me as weird about this was I kept expecting the crystal to turn black from the fire or residue from the burning sticks, but it never did. Instead, it just sort of glowed brighter, and then all at once he stops mumbling and a fissure appears through the center of the quartz. Like a seam that had always been there that the fire had only made visible, if that makes sense. He blew the fire out and picked it up and tossed it to me. It was cool to the touch, which seemed weird to me but may just be a property of quartz. I wouldn't know how long it would take to heat a piece. He told me not to be a dumbass again, and my string of bad luck ended as quickly as it started.
I have a friend, we'll call him Andy, and he has anxiety issues. He was in a long-distance relationship a few years back, and his girlfriend was flying in from near Seattle all the way down to Lafayette, Louisiana. He was unfamiliar with the airport terminal's location, so he asked me to show him the easiest way to get there. Unfamiliar routes always increase his anxiety levels, so I gladly obliged. He picked me up later that night and we headed toward the airport. We always tend to hang out by riding around town and shooting the shit, and it was said so we were planning on doing just that after our excursion to the airport anyway. It was probably around 11 p.m. at this point. I show him the most efficient route, and as we're getting ready to turn onto the main road back, he makes an accidental left instead of right. I thought he did this intentionally at first, so I didn't say anything, but he soon voiced his concern about where we headed. He had passed up all the major roads on our right accidentally, and there were no turnarounds on our left. 4-lane road with dividers or intersections up ahead. Only the next little town, which was a couple miles ahead. I suggested we just exit there and turn around. He was doing all right at this point, but his nerves were just starting to show. We exit into the town, city, and keep going looking for a place to turn around. We come up to and go through a roundabout. Somehow we both didn't take note of what direction we were headed now. We made our way deeper into the town, and he pulled into and turned around in a parking lot. We headed back in what we thought was the way we came, but soon realized we were lost. Both he and I had never been there, so we didn't know how to get back. He handed me his phone as I still only had a flip and told me to pull up the GPS. I opened the app, but it wouldn't work for whatever reason. He pulled over and tried again. It still wouldn't give us our location. He tried everything else he could think of, but still no dice. This wasn't too unexpected, as he had been having issues with the phone lately. So now we took stock of our situation and tried to form a plan. We drove around looking for an open business or gas station to ask for directions, but had no luck whatsoever. The only thing we could think to do was attempt to keep tracing our path and look for landmarks, but it was dark, so that wasn't helping. We drove down all sorts of winding roads, occasionally finding ourselves near something we saw earlier. But that didn't lead us back to the highway. We were going down one particular road that led sort of out in the country. Neither of us were scared or agitated at our present situation by this point, and had actually started to laugh at how ridiculous it was becoming. We were lost in 2014 and technology couldn't help us. After getting back seemingly closer to town, we pulled onto another random road. We were coming up to a left curve in the road when we passed in front of a white house on the right side of the curve. There was a gravel parking lot along the front of its front short wooden fence, but no business sign or anything of that kind. There were 8 to 10 vehicles parked in the lot facing the road, all with their dim lights on, but no one in them or in the yard. No one could be seen moving inside the house either, yet all the lights seemed to be on. The house was an older-looking 2-story with strange tall barred windows along the front bottom floor. This was about 12:30 at this point. When I first looked over at the house, I got this instant rush of dread and fear. It's hard to describe, but it was similar to the kind you get when you go into fight or flight mode. There was a green SUV in front of us at the time, and they pulled into the left part of the parking lot in front of us. Andy continued on around the curve in silence. As soon as we rounded the curve, he looked at me briefly and in a scared voice said,
What was that?
I was still inexplicably shaken and replied, What?
The house. There's something wrong with that house.
It took me a moment to process this, and I told him about the instant feeling of fear I had myself. He said when we were passing it he looked over at it and felt the exact same thing. We couldn't for the life of us explain it. The house just felt oppressive and wrong, as if something really bad was happening inside as we passed. It instantly killed our jovial mood. To make a long story short, Andy's girlfriend happened to call him not long after this to finalize the travel details. He told her what happened with me chiming in here and there over speakerphone. She could tell we were shaken up and offered to guide us out. We gave her an intersection street signs and she looked it up and gave us directions back. We luckily didn't pass back in front of the house. After Andy finished the call, we discussed the experience all the way back to my house, but between the two of us couldn't come up with a plausible explanation. I have never experienced anything of the sort to date and am very skeptical and rational. Yet I had and have no rational explanation for this.
So let's start with a little bit of info. So where this happened is in Eagan, Louisiana, back in the woods at my grandparents' house. They have a ranch-style house with about an acre or two cleared in every direction away from the house. Past that it's dense Louisiana swamp and woods. In 1995 I was 5 years old. My grandparents and I had just finished eating some ice cream. My grandmother was washing dishes while I was rinsing them. Over the sink there was a window that overlooked the backyard. It was about 9 p.m. so it was pitch black outside when out of nowhere it seemed to suddenly be daylight outside. There was a huge light passing over the backyard from west to east, not more than 30 feet off the ground, quietly humming. It wasn't really a light, more like a giant ball of flames, but it was moving too slow to be a crashing plane or anything like that. It went from barely moving to zipping off in an instant with a bright flash and a boom seconds later. Then it was pitch black again. We both stood there in disbelief. I asked Gammy what it was. She said, "I don't know, honey, let's go get Pawpaw." That was the last thing I remember. Then I was awake in my bed. Not too long after that I think I was taken for the first time. I remember vividly waking up floating over my bed. Blankets still around me, pillows under my head. I had a sense of calm flow over me and I went back to sleep. The next morning I woke up on top of my bookshelf to my mom yelling at me, asking how I had gotten up there by myself. I told her my guardian angel. I grew up in a Catholic family, so that's the way I rationalized it, had put me up there. Ever since then I remember being deathly afraid of the gray faces. Still gives me the chills now.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.